Hello, my name is Mustafa Oz and I am an assistant professor at the School of Journalism and Electronic Media. Today I am going to present my paper titled Intolerant versus Uncivil, Examining Types, Directions, and Deliberative Attributes of Incivility on Facebook versus Twitter. In this study, I argued that not all uncivil comments are harmful to the deliberative process. Some uncivil comments might even have some deliberative attributes. Second, this paper further argued that toxicity levels of incivility might increase if incivility is personal. In other words, if an intolerant or uncivil comment specifically targets discussion participants, then that kind of intolerant and uncivil comment could be more harmful to the deliberative process than impersonal incivility. Finally, this study examined whether uncivil and intolerant comments vary based on platforms and issue sensitivity. I argued that even though Twitter and Facebook are both social media platforms, according to the literature, people have different networks and have different affordances on these platforms. Therefore, I expected to see a difference between Facebook and Twitter in terms of intolerant and uncivil discourse. The conceptualization of incivility varies based on scholars. While some defined incivility as impolite behaviors that violate social norms, others suggested that the concept of impoliteness is different than incivility. They suggested that while impoliteness does not harm deliberation and democratic process, incivility does. Also, another group of scholars acknowledged incivility and impoliteness as different concepts, but they suggested that there is a need for a more nuanced approach to understand uncivil discourse because the toxicity levels of incivility might differ. As a result, some types of incivility, for example, intolerance, might harm the deliberative process more than others. Even though there was no consensus on the definition of incivility, many scholars agreed on the negative outcome of incivility. Incivility might discourage people from participating in discussions, harm the deliberation and the democratic process. Especially when people discuss sensitive issues, uncivil behavior increases even more. As Habermas suggested, deliberation is necessary for a democratic society. The purpose of deliberation is to find solutions to civic matters and reach a political consensus without violence. Deliberative communications creates an inclusive and evidence-based discussion environment. Therefore, discussion participants learn from each other and become well-informed citizens. Many scholars argue that deliberative communication should be rational, meaning that it should be evidence-based and logical. Also, some scholars suggested that rationality feature requires people to stick to the same topic. Other scholars suggested that deliberative communication requires source and evidence. Especially in online discussions, users should provide external links, articles, or additional evidence to support their argument to have a deliberative conversation. So in this study, I examined three qualities of deliberation: rationality, sourcing, and interactivity to see whether the tweets and comments contain any of these deliberative attributes. Finally, in this study, I proposed that there will be fewer uncivil and intolerant posts on Facebook than on Twitter due to social media affordances and network characteristics of each platform. Many online incivility scholars attempted to understand how platform affordances might influence users' opinion expression behaviors. According to Gibson, some affordances might prevent people from certain behaviors. For example, scholars concluded that anonymity, visibility, and identifiability affordances might significantly influence users' opinion expression behaviors. Also, as Goffman argued that people's network can influence their future actions. For example, on Facebook, people tend to have their friends, relatives, and their strong ties. So their network and their identification levels might discourage them from using uncivil and intolerant rhetoric. Data was collected from the White House's Twitter and Facebook pages. I selected immigration and healthcare issues as my sensitive issues. Non-sensitive issues were the president's visits and technology-related topics. So let's talk about findings. I expected to see some differences between two platforms, Facebook versus Twitter, in terms of uncivil, intolerant discourse and deliberative attributes. According to the results, there were more deliberative comments on Facebook than Twitter. Also, the results suggested that intolerance was likely to occur on Facebook versus Twitter. Also, the logistic regression analysis suggested that intolerance and incivility were negatively related to deliberative attributes. It means deliberation was less likely to occur when incivility and intolerance present. The results also suggested that there were more deliberative comments on Facebook than Twitter. In other words, Facebook discussions were 46% more likely to contain deliberative comments than Twitter discussions. Also, there was a negative relationship between Facebook and intolerance. However, there was no significant difference between Facebook and Twitter in terms of uncivil discourse. Results also suggested that intolerance was more likely to occur when comments were direct replies. In other words, intolerance was 2.5 times likely to happen when discussions participants were directly replying to other users. On the other hand, there was no significant relationship between direct replies and uncivil comments. Incivility is not perceived as one overarching concept. Scholars do not yet have a shared understanding of uncivil discourse. Some contend that incivility should be studied as impoliteness, while others argue that incivility is better conceptualized as threats to democratic norms. This study addressed the conceptualization struggle by offering theoretical and empirical evidence for a two-dimensional approach to incivility. Consistent with the literature, the results suggested that sensitive topics were more likely to attract uncivil and intolerant comments. This is a bad news for online political discussions because both uncivil and intolerant comments were common in sensitive topic discussions where we need public consensus more. The results also suggested that uncivil comments were mainly generic and did not target discussion participants. On the other hand, intolerance comments were likely to target discussion participants. Again, the literature suggested that if incivility is personal, people tend to see that type of incivility as more offensive. Since intolerant comments tend to target discussion participants, this type of incivility might threaten discussion plurality and harm the deliberative process. One contribution of this study is that it distinguishes extreme incivility from less extreme ones. As some researchers suggested, people can use uncivil expressions to stand out and gain attention. But this type of incivility does not necessarily to be toxic and harm the deliberation. On the other hand, an extreme level of incivility, in this case intolerance, could harm the deliberative process, discussion plurality, and could be seen as more toxic than uncivil expressions. That's why researchers and policymakers should not see all uncivil comments as inherently toxic. Finally, the results suggested that social media platforms are not a singular experience. People tend to use these platforms differently, and affordances and network characteristics of platforms might influence uncivil and intolerant discourse on these platforms.